This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 23 of season 4 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, June 10th, 1911, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Mrs. John Bateman Fletcher, whose maiden name was Eliza Jane Chandler, has the sympathy of her friends owing to the death and burial of her sister, Mrs. Eliza Perham, in Tingsboro last week. She died May 29th and was buried in Tingsboro on May 31st, 1911. Mrs. Will R. Carver of Somerville and little daughter are spending the summer months in Westford. Mr. and Mrs. George W. Good have returned from spending the winter in New York and are at their camp at Forge Pond for the season. The Academy graduation, which takes place in the Town Hall on Friday, June 30th, promises to be an attractive event. There are 10 in the graduating class. This is Westford Academy now, 10 people. A nicely balanced number of 5 young men and 5 young maidens. George W. Hill, who for many years lived on the Cold Spring Road, but who for some time has lived with relatives in Athol, died there on June 1st. He was 75 years of age and had been in feeble health for some time. We'll read a little bit more about him shortly. The ball game this Saturday afternoon at Whitney Park at 3 o'clock will be between the Westford Athletic Association and the YMCA team. Presumably that's the Lowell YMCA. During this quiescent period for the average member, the executive board of the Tadmuck Club are busy with meetings making up the program for next season's work and enjoyment. Last season's plan of a special topic for study will be followed, interspersed with miscellaneous subjects of interest. The change in membership fee has not apparently interrupted the loyalty of the members, there being a general expression of intention to remain on the list. I believe they had increased the fee, the annual dues for the Tadmuck Club from 50 cents to $1 the previous year. The State Inspector of Almshouses, E.K. Bradford, in his recent inspection of our farm, reported it fully up to its usual standard of well-kept excellence under the care of Mr. and Mrs. Edson G. Boynton. The welcome rain interfered with the practice drill of the Edward M. Abbott Hose Company, scheduled for Tuesday night. Westford friends will be interested in the fact that Mrs. Carrie E. and Florence Reed of Barry have bought for themselves a house there, choosing to own rather than rent their home. These were daughters of the Honorable Joseph Henry Reed of Westford, who lived at 30 Main Street, which is the large house on Main Street at the northwest corner with Graniteville Road. Walter J. Merritt has broken ground for the erection of a second dwelling house, this one to be back of the one now occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Wiley M. Wright. This is for the occupancy of Mrs. Tyler of Arlington when completed. Sunday, June 18th, Reverend David Wallace will exchange pulpits with Reverend Charles P. Marshall of Quincy. Mr. Marshall will be a welcome occupant of his former pulpit. He was the pastor of the Union Congregational Church from 1905 to 1910. Sunday, June 25th, will be Children's Sunday. One way of showing appreciation of the new Whitney Park by the young people would be a happy spirit of cooperation with the caretakers in keeping it free from clutter in the way of old paper, etc. Possibly a receptacle for rubbish, such as provided by our state parks, would aid in the matter. The recent rain has done much for the shrubbery, grass, etc. Mrs. Edward Fisher was a guest on Wednesday at a luncheon given by Mrs. Ann Carmichael Bicknell at her home in Somerville to a group of congenial friends. The next paragraph is about the Westford Grange. The meeting of the Grange last week, Thursday evening, was the annual Children's Night, and every effort was made to have the young folks have a good time. There was a good attendance, and the program by the children consisted of songs, recitations, duets, etc. By special request, the young girls who danced the Highland Fling so attractively at the Whitney Playground dedication repeated that feature. This was much enjoyed, although not as picturesque as the open-air performance. Ice cream and cake was served to all in the lower hall in charge of Mrs. Arthur Blodgett. The next meeting, June 15th, will be a roll call in charge of Mrs. Josephine Prescott with special music. The next section is the About Town section. Come dine with us today and try those, quote, first, end quote, peas, right fresh from the old Oaken Bucket farm and close to the sunny side of the old Stony Brook schoolhouse. Especially come you Superintendent Smith of Graniteville. Let us have reciprocity in this contest of first peas. Come you today, and in a week hence, when yours are ready, this is Samuel L. Taylor writing, I will reciprocate without invitation. I believe every year there was an article similar to this. There was always an informal competition between Westford gardeners to see who had the first peas ripe enough to eat. Oscar R. Spaulding has sold the Coolidge Farm to Frank E. Miller, the superintendent of roads. I believe the Coolidge Farm was on the hill going down from Westford Center towards Forge Village on Forge Village Road. Carpenter, that is the surname Carpenter, the blacksmith, formerly of North Chelmsford and less formerly of Graniteville, is doing, quote, carpenter work, the work of a carpenter, at the blacksmith shop of Mr. Miller at Westford Center. Mrs. Luke L. Fletcher, maiden name Lucy J. Walker, of Arlington, has been a recent town guest and attended the Unitarian Church on Sunday. It brought in review to memory former associations. Her husband, Luke Lawrence Fletcher, died in 1883. At a meeting of the veterans held at the Cavalry Building at 20 Boston Road, which is now a house, formerly a school, last week, Thursday, J. Everett Woods was elected commander, A.I. Bicknell vice commander, that's capital A, little I, that's a first name, A.I. Vice Commander, Wayland F. Balch, Secretary, Samuel Humiston, Treasurer, and Fred Hildreth, Chaplain. Amos Poley commenced haying on Monday and is pushing on to the finish. Keep up with the procession if you can. Tree Warden Harry L. Nesmith has a new arrival of nursery stock. His daughter, Ruth Nesmith Hall, was born June 5th, 1911. The paving stone strike on Oak Hill has been settled in favor of employer and employee. The next meeting of the Middlesex North Conference of Unitarian Churches will be held at Ashby on Wednesday, June 21st. The annual parish meeting of the Unitarian Church will be held in the vestry on Monday evening, June 19th. The next couple paragraphs are titled Deaths. George Washington Hill died at Athol on Thursday, June 1st, at the home of his son. Mr. Hill was a former resident of Westford, having lived here about 50 years, owning a small place on Cold Spring Road. He was 75 years of age and leaves several children. The funeral was at Athol, and burial was in the Edson Cemetery in Lowell. Miss Elizabeth A. Frederick, née Hildreth, died in Lowell on June 1st, aged 79 years. She will be remembered as the widow of George Sumner Frederick, he went by the name Sumner, and resident of Westford for many years, their home being on the Tenney Road near Keyes and Longsought Ponds. Mr. Frederick was for several years a member of the school committee in the olden days of the old school district system. At that time, there were 10 separate school districts within the town of Westford. Both were greatly attached to their farm and rural life and scenery of the north frontier of Westford. The funeral of Mrs. Frederick took place on Sunday afternoon from the home of her daughter, Mrs. D.W. Parker. Reverend C.E. Fisher of the First Universalist Church officiated. The bearers were Daniel W. Parker, George Frederick, Frank Hardy, and William Blodgett. Burial was in the Hillside Cemetery in Westford. The next paragraph is on the WCTU. One of the most successful and stirring meetings of the WCTU was held at the vestry of the Congregational Church on Wednesday afternoon, about 75 being present. The meeting was known as Mother's Day and was in charge of Mrs. David Wallace. A large display of babyhood flowers were present with their mothers. The church was also tastefully decorated with the flowers of the field, the skill and labor of love of Elliot Humiston. Ice cream was bountifully furnished, the labor of love of Reverend and Mrs. David Wallace. Interesting literary exercises also added to the cheer of the occasion. The decorative flowers were given to the WCTU, that's the Women's Christian Temperance Union, of Boston, to be distributed among the poor of Boston. Mrs. Jeanette Wright acted as president in the absence of Mrs. Franco Hildreth, the usual presiding officer. Next, we have the Forge Village section. Robert Whittemore and family, together with Harry Howland and family of Worcester, journeyed to this village in auto last week and spent a few days with Mrs. Mary I. Drake, maiden name Bennett. Upon reaching their destination, they took luncheon under the well-known pines and enjoyed their holiday immensely. Alvin Bennett has returned from a most enjoyable trip out west. Miss Elizabeth Plummer has been called to the bedside of her brother, who is seriously ill at his home in Salem. Miss Grace Lawrence and Miss Elizabeth Plummer spent last Tuesday visiting friends in Westford. Miss Eliza Daly has returned from a visit with relatives in Boston. At 9:30 a.m., memorial services were held by Loyal Self-Help Lodge, IOOF, that's the Odd Fellows, at St. Andrew's Mission and were largely attended last Sunday. The lodge marched in uniform to and from the mission and made a fine appearance. Reverend A.L. Bumpus preached a very appropriate sermon, which was thoroughly enjoyed by all who attended. After the sermon, a delegation from the lodge went to Fairview Cemetery, Westford, to decorate the graves of the deceased members. Whit Sunday, or Pentecost, was observed last Sunday morning at Abbott Hall and was severely taxed with a large congregation. Reverend M.E. Doherty of North Chelmsford officiated and delivered a sermon on the day. The regular choir, under the direction of Miss Mary F. Hanley, sang appropriate selections. This was the congregation of St. Catherine's Catholic Church, their church still undergoing renovation. Reverend M.E. Doherty announced that the annual church picnic of the whole parish of North Chelmsford, Graniteville, and Forge Village will be held this year at Crystal Lake, North Chelmsford, on July 4th. Daniel Sullivan of Boston is visiting his friends, Mr. and Mrs. John Sullivan. He is accompanied by his uncle, Daniel Sullivan of Boston. Miss Roxy Bennett of Worcester is visiting at the home of Alvin Bennett. The Mrs. Bertha and Lena Wilson entertained friends from Cambridge on Sunday. The Imperial Campers of Lowell have rented one of William H.P. Hardy's camps for the season. Loyal Self-Help Lodge, IOOF, that's again the Oddfellows, held their regular meeting in Abbott Hall on Monday morning. One member was initiated. The Ladies' Sewing Circle met on Wednesday afternoon at the house of Mrs. Bert Comey. A daily luncheon was served after the meeting. A dainty luncheon was served after the meeting. Cameron School closed for the annual summer vacation last week, Friday afternoon. Next is a list of new books added to the library. I won't read them all, but the first one has an interesting title. It's by A. Bennett, and it's titled How to Live on 24 Hours a Day. Sounds like a good read. That's the news in Westford for the week ending June 10th, 1911. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.